Different generations, different experiences, but at the core of it all, the same need for respect. This isn't just about age groups. It's about understanding people and leading them properly. Today's Respect Perspective. For the first time in modern history, we have 4, sometimes 5, generations working side by side in the same workplace. That should be a strength. Different experiences, different perspectives, different ways of thinking. But instead, a lot of workplaces are experiencing something very different: misunderstanding, judgment, breakdowns in communication, resentment, and leadership gaps. And it doesn't usually start with bad intent. It starts here. People judge behavior without taking the time to understand what shaped it. When you look at how different generations were shaped, you have to start with the reality they were living in. Many older generations built their careers in a world where housing was more attainable. One income could support a household. Wages stretched further. Pensions were common, and loyalty was often rewarded. That was the environment. Now compare that to today. You have households with 2 full-time incomes, still struggling, housing prices that have completely detached from wages, inflation putting pressure on everyday essentials, rising debt, childcare costs overwhelming families, and a constant level of financial stress that never really turns off. That's a very different reality. And when people are living under that kind of pressure, it changes how they think, how they work, and how they cope. When we look at baby boomers, we have to understand what shaped them. They came up during a period of economic expansion, with more traditional career paths, where long tenure was rewarded, hierarchy was respected, and professionalism was face-to-face. You showed up, you put in the work, and over time you built something stable. And because of that environment, they developed real strengths: loyalty, a strong work ethic, consistency, experience, and resilience. Now where things start to break down is how they're sometimes perceived today. You'll hear words like rigid or outdated, but that's not the full picture. The reality is, they were built in a world where stability mattered. So the way they approach work is rooted in consistency, commitment, and structure, not resistance. And when you understand that, you stop judging the behavior and you start respecting where it came from. When we look at Generation X, they were shaped during a very different kind of period. They lived through recessions and a lot of transition. There was less stability, less structure, and a lot less hand-holding. So they developed independence early. They learned how to rely on themselves, figure things out, and adapt as things changed, especially with the early waves of technology disruption. They were also the generation where we really started to see the beginnings of work-life balance. Now, because of that environment, they bring some very strong strengths into the workplace: practicality, self-reliance, adaptability, strong management instincts, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. They don't need a lot of noise, they just get things done. But here's what often gets missed. They're often overlooked. Because they're not the loudest. They're not always the most vocal. But the reality is, they quietly carry a lot. They're often the ones holding things together, managing up, managing down, keeping operations moving, without needing recognition for it. And when you understand that, you start to see their value very differently. When we look at millennials, they came into a very different environment. They experienced rising student debt, rapid shifts in technology, and a noticeable decline in housing affordability. At the same time, workplaces became more collaborative, and people became constantly connected. There was no real off switch anymore. So the way they approached work started to change. They still work hard, but they want growth, they want feedback, they want purpose in what they're doing. And because of that, they bring some very strong strengths into organizations: innovation, teamwork, learning agility, a strong sense of purpose, and a higher awareness of culture. They think differently, and they challenge things that don't make sense. Now where millennials are often misunderstood is people assume they don't want to work the same way. But the reality is, they didn't reject work. They rejected outdated systems that lacked development, lacked communication, or lacked meaning. And when you understand that, you stop seeing resistance and you start seeing a push for better. When we look at Generation Z, we're looking at a generation shaped by a completely different world. They grew up with social media from a young age. They went through a global pandemic during critical development years. They're entering adulthood under real inflation pressure. And they've grown up in a time where mental health is talked about more openly. On top of that, they're dealing with constant information. Non-stop. So naturally. They think fast. They adapt quickly. And they process the world differently. And because of that, they bring real strengths. Digital fluency. Efficiency in how they think and work. Authenticity. Speed to learn. And the courage to question things that don't make sense. Now here's the important truth. Generation Z is often more emotionally aware. They're more sensitive to things like toxic leadership, injustice, exclusion, manipulation, and environments that don't feel right. And that's where the misunderstanding happens, because what some people interpret as being too sensitive is often just a lower tolerance for dysfunction. They're not trying to make work harder, they're less willing to normalize unhealthy workplaces, and when you understand that, you stop seeing weakness, and you start seeing awareness. When people talk about Generation Z job hopping, you'll often hear it described as entitlement, that they don't stick, that they don't commit. But when you look a little deeper, that's not usually what's happening. More often than not, it's burnout. It's a lack of development. It's feeling disrespected. It's no flexibility. It's poor leadership. It's emotional exhaustion. And it's not seeing any real path forward. So instead of assuming people just don't want to stay, you have to ask a better question. Why would they? Because the reality is simple. When people feel trapped, they leave. Today, a lot of employees don't quit loudly anymore. They don't walk in and make a big exit. They stay, but something changes. They quietly start to withdraw effort. They stop caring the same way. They protect their energy. They emotionally detach from the work and the environment. And often, they start looking elsewhere without saying a word. From the outside, it can look like disengagement, but underneath, something has shifted. Because this isn't usually about laziness, it's accumulated stress. It's what happens when effort goes unnoticed, when pressure builds, and when people stop feeling like what they do actually matters. This is where conflict actually starts, not in behavior, in how we label it. We hear things like, they're soft, they're entitled, they don't work hard, they micromanage, they hate change, they only care about money. Those statements show up in almost every workplace. But here's the problem. Most of them aren't facts. They're shortcuts. They're what we say when we don't take the time to understand what's really going on. Because when you look deeper, there's usually context behind the behavior. There's pressure, there's experience, there's a different way of thinking. But instead of understanding it, we label it. And that's where conflict starts. Because the reality is, most generational conflict is just lazy leadership language. This is what great leaders start to understand. Different generations often value different things. If you look at it clearly, boomers tend to value respect, recognition, and stability. Gen X values trust, autonomy, and efficiency. Millennials are looking for growth, feedback, and purpose. And Gen Z values flexibility, inclusion, and development. Now, on the surface, that can feel very different, and that's where a lot of leaders get stuck. But here's the shift. People haven't changed as much as we think. The core needs are still there. People want to feel respected. They want to feel trusted. They want to grow. They want to feel like what they do matters. What's changed is how those needs are communicated. And when leaders understand that, they stop trying to force one approach, and they start adapting how they lead. If we take a step back from opinion and just look at the data, a very clear picture starts to emerge. Cost of living in Canada has risen roughly 35 to 45% since 2010, with a sharp acceleration after 2020. At the same time, housing prices have increased over 100% in many major markets, far outpacing wage growth, which has pushed housing affordability to near historic lows across the country. Because of that, dual-income households are no longer an advantage. They've become the baseline, just to stay afloat. And all of this shows up in how people feel. Financial stress is now one of the leading drivers of anxiety and distraction at work. Workplace stress and burnout have increased significantly, especially since 2020. And despite all of that, expectations haven't adjusted. Performance expectations, output, availability, they've all continued to rise. So when people show up differently today, this isn't a mindset issue. It's a reality issue. Just take a second and think about this. If people are struggling more than ever, why are we expecting more from them with less support? Different generations are not the problem. Ignoring reality is the problem. And until organizations truly understand the reality people are living in, engagement, performance, and loyalty will always be unstable. Because the truth is, too many companies are criticizing younger workers while ignoring how much harder life became. Housing costs exploded. Inflation rose. Stress increased. People changed. So leadership has to change too. Book a consultation. Visit therespecteffect.com. Follow for more insights.